Yeah, I'm leader of the Global Change Research Group here at Arctic Center since 2004, but I actually arrived here in 1994 as a postdoc, Fulbright stipend, coming from Canada, where I'd been trained in geography at McGill University. So I've been working with Indigenous peoples and I've been working in Arctic social ecological systems now for 35 years. And I went originally to focus on disturbance ecology, which is looking at different kinds of natural and anthropogenic impacts. I was focused on permafrost soils and tundra vegetation and how they recovered over or regenerated over decadal timescales. But while there, I was working with Inuit and then later Nenets and eventually Sami reindeer herders. So my worldview and my research has developed over time into basically looking at stakeholder driven questions. What are the things that people who live here in the Arctic, and I live 20 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle here, what do they need to know from research, or how can research aid in their ability to navigate the modern milieu of complex livelihoods and competition for operational space that is getting fierce at the same time that the climate is warming. So that's kind of how Charter is positioned now, and also how I got here 26 years ago. It was about November 2017, so 2.5 years ago. A postdoc I worked closely with in Vienna sent an email of an early draft of what became the first Cryosphere Call by the European Commission, meaning the cryosphere is the world's cold regions where water is often in solid form, be it permafrost or lake ice or glaciers. And this was something new, so I looked carefully in that, and then I saw, okay, they're going to put up for one subtopic called Changing Arctic Biodiversity up to 6 million euros to look at combined natural and human influences on Arctic biodiversity, feedbacks to climate. And what struck me was they were highlighting the social and economic importance of this. What were the implications of changing biodiversity for the people that live there? And this is kind of what I've been interested in. So they said definitely the actions should identify adaptation strategies in relation to this, not just biodiversity, but the changing cryosphere, and that social sciences and humanities would be front and center. And I thought, this is something we do in Arctic Center. It's something my group I've worked with for many years do, and also my larger network. So I immediately contacted several of these people and I said, do you want to put together a proposal? And they said yes, definitely. And but that was 2.5 years ago, so it's taken a long time to get to this point, and you need a lot of patience, and you need good colleagues who you trust and who are in turn trusted within these communities where you work, because you know full well you come in as an outsider and go, hello, I'm here to study climate change, and I go, thanks, no thanks. I prefer the questions that come up naturally, and actually 26 years ago nobody was talking about climate change here. People talk about weather, but no, it's evolved. It kind of snowballed. In the beginning, we ended up with a 21 member consortium. That's 21 partner institutions spread across 9 EU countries, but that doesn't reflect the full consortium, because we've also got participation and or co-funding from Russia, China, Canada, the US. I actually have a parallel project, Arctic Rain on Snow study, funded by the National Science Foundation. which is going to run concurrently with this, and actually has one of the key partners, Julian Struve from University College London, who's a sea ice specialist. So we're going to be working not just with the charter team, which is huge and has substantial resources, but it's never enough. But we partner with other projects that will run concurrently. So postdoc and scientific manager in charter, Sirpa Erasmus, has a new project, Clemini. Another EU project just north was just funded, and postdoc Mia Landauer in Vienna, who originally showed me this call, is going to be working. So we'll be sharing personnel and resources across different projects and countries where thematic overlap exists with the charter objectives. Yeah, the call was rather general and vague. We looked at this from the quote in there about a community or societal benefits. I had to think about that too, because when I came up here in 1994, I noticed quickly, coming from a North American background, that it was a completely different research setup here, where indigenous and northern residents really had no legal rights or stake in natural resource management. In going back to the oil and gas and James Bay developments in Canada and Alaska, rights were encoded in a process called cooperative management or co-management, where people have a say in how many polar bears or narwhal are harvested, how many caribou can be hunted, and so on. And then I came here and I saw, okay, there's reindeer everywhere, but this operates entirely on usufruct rights, meaning that the reindeer graze on public and private lands, but the reindeer herders here, and I was already working in Soviet Union since 1991, where there's a lot of oil and gas development, they had no role in the decision making about how these are going to operate now, have operated in the past, and how they are going to operate in the future. And it's as I said, it's a shared space. The operational space for everything is constantly shrinking. We've got new tourist developments. We have lots of forestry, other things going on here. And I realized, like, okay, but how does that work here? How are you going to navigate something like that when the governance just doesn't involve local people? And this was before climate change. So we were finishing my first EU funded project on reindeer management kind of 2004, just before the Arctic climate impact assessment was published. And in 2001 to 2004, when that project was actually co-developed with Sami herders in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. It was the first big project to do that kind of co-development and look at these issues together. But the issue wasn't climate change. The issue was long-term dysfunctional reindeer governance, that everybody I talked to said, you know, look, talk to herders, how does it work up here? They go, it doesn't. We have no say here. We're told how many animals we have, and you know, how many to slaughter and how much they have to weigh and everything. And I said, okay, that project ended. Then along came Arctic climate impact assessment. Everybody started talking from 2004 onward about climate change, but herders didn't talk about climate change. And I realized, okay, that conversation is not resolved yet. Extreme weather is ramping up. The climate is clearly warming. So how are people going to continue to adapt if they're not involved in decision making? The governance is not adaptive. It's not changing at all, much less keeping pace with the level of change we were suddenly experiencing in the time I arrived here. So this lack of participatory approach kind of stuck with me. And I realized when this extreme weather started to ramp up, when the climate started to warm, I noticed herders actually starting both in Russia and in Venezuela, they did start to talk about extreme weather. but it was in the context of all the other things: the oil and gas development, the forestry, the lack of rights. How do you how do you navigate this if you've got a governance system that looks at meat production and kilograms of lichen per square kilometer, meanwhile taking out all the pulp and paper you can, and all the berries and fish and everything else? So this was kind of the background for when the Cryosphere Call came, and I saw, okay, how does society benefit from research? And I said, okay, first of all, we've got to get researchers actually talking to administrators and policymakers and scientists and herders from other regions to compare what's going on in your region. What are the issues there? How are you dealing with that? Okay, wow, you've got a different situation than us, but the key link is herders need to be part of the conversation, and not just herders, all local residents. I focused on herding because that is where when I first came here and I first went to West Siberia in 1991, it is a de facto reindeer herding area for centuries, long before the oil and gas were discovered, long before the forestry moved north up here and the agriculture. These livelihoods have been around a long time, and they just had to adapt to a constantly shrinking space, and that's not going away. But the climate is warming. Herders do talk about it now. They didn't talk about it in Nicaea, but they really don't talk so much about climate change. It's the extreme weather events, the punctuated events, whether, like right now, you just saw it was, what was it, 38 degrees Celsius in East Siberia last week. In West Siberia, it's up in the mid 30s. My colleague Florian Stamler is there now. They're doing a crash vaccination for anthrax, because the last time we had such a warm summer in 2016, it broke the temperature records, and it also went on for so many weeks that the permafrost active layer thawed to such a depth that an old contaminated carcass from 1947 thawed out. There was an anthrax outbreak. So that's an extreme summer event. There were fires, there was methane bubbling up from the tundra, but in this project, we're also going to look at warmer winters and the linkages between what's happening on land, which is you were here in Lapland, so there were a lot of freeze-thaw events. It was going up above zero in January and then refreezing, and we ended up with a basal ice crust below the deep snow, which my son and I broke a shovel trying to dig my sauna in the backyard. So that the warmer winters have to be looked at too. People tend to focus on the summer because it's a heat wave, but the warmer winters, if you're coming from a reindeer herding perspective, you'll say that's equally or more important, because your pregnant females are at risk. They're carrying a calf. If they can't give birth to a healthy calf, it'll die, or maybe both the mother and the calf will die. And that's what people in the run-up to this project were saying is concerning them. In Finland, we've got a situation, all the Nordic countries now, where you feed the animals, particularly the pregnant females, from kind of January to April to buffer against that mortality, whereas there's no such thing in Russia. And, we're going to look broadly. We're going to be looking at a region from mainly Greenland in the west to, furthermost West Siberia and all across there. So the Nordic countries and parts of northern Russia, and then its autonomous Okrug, Komi Republic, Yamal, Murmansk Oblast, where semi-domesticated, privately owned reindeer are pretty much ranging everywhere and dealing with all these other land users, as well as a warming climate, yet pretty much cut out of the decision-making process. We've got two things really. We have different time scales. We have different spatial scales. So We're looking in the past. We have paleo ecologists in here. We have people looking at decadal timescales, so things that happened, for example, in the post-World War II era, and not just in terms of what you see, trees growing, vegetation change. Also, the governance is a big issue. What has happened in terms of policies, the way reindeer herding was reframed from a livelihood to an agricultural enterprise, how the norms that exist today and the metrics that are used have not evolved, they've not kept pace. So we have social anthropologists, we also have an expert advisory group of outsiders who are from the relevant ministries, reindeer herding administration, government administration like in Yamal. And then we'll be looking at centennial timescales too. So we'll be looking back in time as these livelihoods have developed, how the social ecological systems have changed now. And then we'll be doing modeling with Arctic regional climate and sea ice people to look at about 50 years out from now. So mid-late 21st century, what are the projections based on the best climate and reanalysis data of what has happened? And we've done pretty good. We've tested a fingerprinting method to look at how collapsing or degrading sea ice in the Barents and Kara Sea has been linked to rain on snow events in West Siberia. And what's been published a lot is like how Svalbard reindeer have been affected by this, but nobody lives on Svalbard reindeer. They're not even allowed to be hunted. You've got millions of animals, for example, on the Eurasian continent, who, as I said, they're privately owned, they're semi domesticated. These are people's livelihood. A lot of people lost all their reindeer in the last big rain on snow event in 2013-14 in West Siberia. They're still living out on the tundra as functional full-time fishermen. And the oil and gas development is going on around them. So when you talk about biodiversity, it's also a skewed conversation. So we're going to be looking at not biodiversity just for the sake of economic metrics, but biodiversity in the service of sustaining these livelihoods that have already had to deal with a lot of change going on around them. But they need to be part of the process. So we're going to, our different work packages are dealing with, on the one hand, very minute things down to, for example, using dendroclimatology to reconstruct the summer temperatures, how they've evolved over the last few decades, also the last few centuries, where we get into pollen and other data, and also the sea ice. We'll be able to go back to, in both Charter and the NSF-funded Arctic Rain on Snow project, we'll be able to go back to 1979 with sea ice data that's archived and actually have participatory workshops where we can sit down with herders who, in 1979, people my age were teenagers, but they have pretty good memories of what happened. If there was an extreme winter then where a lot of animals died or they had to suddenly move rapidly to get to pastures they could access, people tend to remember that. They may not remember the exact year, but that's why you have it in a workshop approach where people can say, do you remember that year? Yeah. And then you got a map. And once you geo-reference that information, you can look in the archive to see, did the fingerprinting method we used in 2013 work for that? If it did, you can feed that back into a model to better project what will happen in the future. If what herders have said is, if we have a few days warning and the administrators in places like Yamal, where the slaughterhouses are very far from where animals might be when they actually have their maximum weight, if you could get a mobile slaughterhouse out to those herds that are at risk of starving within the next couple of days, then the herders wouldn't be stranded in the tundra as they are now at fishermen. The animals would be slaughtered humanely, they'd get an economic return. It would be a better situation for all. So that's why we need a kind of collective effort that involves the scientists, the herders, the administrators, everybody along that kind of chain that is going to make the decisions for what happens. This will happen again, but what's going to transpire when it does happen.
Mm.
And that's how the work packages, that's how the work packages are structured, to try to get that universe of information together. It is, but it also helps structure, or helped structure, I should say, how the consortium was chosen. The emphasis on existing data was purposeful, because 6 million euros sounds like a lot of money, but when you're addressing such a complex question and you have a large consortium by necessity, because as you just said, the types of different data needed and the location in different places necessitates a large group, but a large group that has a lot of experience in this. So we have people who've worked for decades in Arctic Russia, speak fluent Russian, or are actually native scholars like Rosa Laptander, from the region, know the administrators, know where to put their finger on paper archives, or mostly in the West, it's digital archives, but still. And then we use networks like the Herbivory Network, led by Isabel Barrio at Agricultural University of Iceland, or the Shrub Hub Network, led by Isla Myers-Smith at Edinburgh University. These have been based on trying to standardize data use and protocols for past experiments and empirical work that has been done using dendroclimatology or shrub growth, greening of the Arctic, herbivory impacts, and then collate that and put it in the surface of the charter questions. And that's why we have to have kind of work packages with strong leaders, and working in tandem with them are the funded postdocs. Almost all the money goes to early career salaries. Those are people who will lead the effort. They will move, they will have mobility funding to move between labs. So I've spent my last 2 weeks, I've talked to all the work package leaders over the last 2 weeks. I've talked to several of the people within the work packages, and we're starting to, if the early career people are already known, what will they do? Where will they go? If they are not known, we have a couple open calls now. Within the project, what we hope to do is improve the existing models that account for Arctic regional climate, but do not have social drivers and feedbacks. If you've been in Fennoscandia or working in Northern Russia for a long time, you know that the biodiversity discussion is focused on overgrazing. Everybody says these Arctic territories, the reindeer populations have grown substantially. Sure, they have. There's incentives. There's a market for meat production. The herding has been rationalized. On the other hand, people say, oh, but the lichens have disappeared. The tundra is destroyed. The herders are bad stewards of the land. But that doesn't take into account the IPCC perspective, which says, actually, parts of the tundra are getting greener. They're becoming more productive. If it's overgrazed, how can it be becoming more productive? And if you want to keep the shrubs from encroaching the tundra, because then it'll have a lower albedo, it'll absorb more light, isn't heavy grazing and trampling by reindeer, which keeps the shrubs out of the tundra, a good idea? And you talk to herders and they go, what do you think of these shrub birches growing up in the fjells? I said, I hate it. There's more bugs, the snow's deeper, you can't see the reindeer, you got to move through this brush, So put reindeer actually as a kind of tool in the toolbox of mitigating climate feedbacks, or at least negative ones, and think about it beyond lichen biomass, beyond kilograms of meat produced per year, and for certainly economic output. Reindeer herding has like zero economic, probably a moderate-sized fish farm in northern Norway has several times the economic output of the entire reindeer meat production in 1 year. So forget about comparing those apples and oranges, but if you want to look at the North and biodiversity, think about how are the people who live here going to keep wanting to live here? What's to keep them from saying, oh, reindeer herding is too difficult, I'm going to go, down south. And then pretty soon the place is depopulated, and pretty soon the fjells are covered by trees. So this overgrazing narrative is part of the project as well. I can't say it's the focus, but when you start to look at biodiversity, you have to think of the political backdrop and what are the drivers, what have been the drivers, what are the drivers in terms of the agenda or of how our Northwest Eurasian Arctic should look. And there's definitely a political idea of that, but the EU takes an agnostic approach. As I said, I think the quote in the beginning, what attracted me to the call in the first place was the actions should identify adaptation strategies in relation to changes in Arctic ecosystems, the participation of social sciences and humanities is important for addressing the complex challenges of this topic. So again, people are at the center of this. It's not just about how many species of plants you have per square kilometer of tundra. It's about how are people, how is society and ancient cultures how are they going to coexist with the modern things, the forestry, the ski areas, the dams, the mines. Everybody's got a right to be here now. Even if you're operating on usufruct rights, you still have some rights. So this is kind of what we'd like at the end. We'd like some benefits in the form of a more participatory process where not just scientific knowledge, but also local knowledge has value in the decisions that will be made. And there's going to have to be decisions made, because you've seen this. I mean, if that high pressure system heads a little further west, that's in Siberia now, it's going to be 38 degrees here soon. And we had that in 2018, the forest fires in Sweden. It was world news. This affects everybody who lives here, and that's why we need to have the people who actually live here be part of the research process. We have an expert advisory group, which are people outside of the project, maybe even outside of research. So they come from government, like the Ministry of Environment in Helsinki, or the governor, vice governor's office of international affairs in Yamal. These are people who wrote support letters. They've helped in the co-development of the project. They helped get it funded, and now they're going to have a guiding hand, starting from hopefully the launch project, the launch meeting in Helsinki, hopefully in October, that these people have a hands-on approach. They have expertise in academia, they are actual indigenous residents, they have governance experience, and they can look at it from the outside and say, okay, have you thought of how you're going to deal with this? Okay, you're just starting now, but what next year, what do you hope to have achieved? Help us set not just the EU deliverable, not the deliverables are set, but how do we meet them, and how do we meet them in a way that is actually going to get us further along the vision of a more participatory process. That's easy. When my brother and I were growing up in the US, we shared a bedroom, and my father put up on 2 walls giant maps. One wall had a map of the world, and the other had a map of North America, from Mexico going up to Canada. And my brother moved away. He got sent off to boarding school when he was 12, so I was there alone most of the time. And I just studied these maps for hours and hours, year after year. And it was Mercator projection, which I didn't know then makes the polar regions look huge relative to they are huge, but it made them look even bigger. So I was looking at, why is there all these blank spaces? There's no place names. There's, you know, one little dot, not a big dot like a city. There was a little dot like a town here. And then there's like 100,000 kilometers till the next dot. I was like, why is it so vast? Why do so few people live there? I had no idea about glaciers and snow. I just thought that's kind of fascinating. And I went up to Vermont and I started doing an undergrad in environmental studies. I started studying Arctic regions already as an undergrad. Then I did a master's at Center for Northern Studies, also in Northern Vermont. And I worked with a biogeographer there, Stephen Young, and his brother, Oren Young, a political scientist. And then I was really I was already hooked as an undergrad, but then I really got hooked. And then it was just a hop up the road to McGill, where I did a PhD in geography. And it was good, but I'm a bit strange by traditional academic standards, because my supervisor was an Inuit ethnographer, George Wenzel, who worked on the social and economic costs of sealing. And I was doing a degree in ecological biogeography, as I said, looking at the plants and vegetation and how they responded to different types of disturbance. But that's how I ended up as a kind of misfit. But misfits are at home in geography. Know that there's no boundaries between natural and social systems, and that's actually the way the Arctic really is. Inuit there. I've worked with Nenets. I've worked with Sami. They all consider themselves part of the ecosystem. They don't say we're outside the system. And all the sentient beings that are there are part of the system too, and they're part of the cosmology. So you can't separate these things out with artificial boundaries.